Okay, everybody, we're just letting people in through the lobby, but I want to wish everybody a very good afternoon and a warm welcome to our second Community Wealth Building Open Learning event for 2022, which is focusing on international perspectives. This series of events aims to promote collaboration and learning on community wealth building to as wide an audience as possible and to encourage thinking and discussion as you embed community wealth building in the work that you do. I'm Liz Mckinley, I'm Chair of EDAS, and I'm absolutely delighted, and I have to say more than just a little bit excited, to be honest with you, about this afternoon's session, as we're welcoming a fantastic lineup of speakers from different parts of the United States. They're here to share their experiences as champions, advocates, activists, and pioneers of community wealth building across the pond. And at a time when we've been so restricted recently in our ability to travel for business, learning, and pleasure, I really hope this afternoon fuels your appetite to connect with and learn from these initiatives in the United States as you take forward your community wealth building work. The speakers come from Ohio, Boston, Chicago, and Pennsylvania, and I'll introduce each of them in turn. They'll all bring a unique take on the development of community wealth building in these locations. As is usual for our meetings, we've muted participants for the duration of the presentations, but I ask that you use the chat box to raise any points of interest or questions, and also feel free to raise your hand after the speakers have finished if you have specific questions for the panel. But to kick off, can I introduce our colleague and friend, Neil McInroy, who's here today in his role as Community Wealth Building Advisor with the Scottish Government to set the context for this afternoon around the similarities and differences between community wealth building in Scotland and the United States. Neil is now also a fellow of the Democracy Collaborative, so he has close ties to that organisation and initiative, and he's been instrumental in bringing forward our speakers today. So we very much thank you for that, Neil, in advance. So over to you to begin proceedings.
Thanks, Liz. Lovely to be at this next open session on this community wealth building journey we're all on, so delighted to be here. I'll just speak for 10 minutes or so, just give a little bit of outline to the similarities and differences between the USA and Scotland around community wealth building. And many of you will be starting to develop, have an understanding of community wealth building. I suppose the wee chance, sometimes it's great, isn't it, to get like, to step out of that context and say, well, how are others looking at this community wealth building? And we've got some great speakers and lessons from America for us to do that. So I think hopefully be instructive for you, a chance for you to pile in the questions and comments, and please do so. You know, our colleagues here from the US want all that, so please pile in as many questions as you want, and we'll see what we can do in answering them. And if we can't get around them all, we'll try and answer them offline. There's 5 key overarching points that drive the community wealth building movement in the USA and in Scotland, and there are similarities here. The first is, and you've heard all this before, the first is that economic development, traditional economic development is failing a bit. Yeah, we know growth and investment doesn't truly deliver change the fortunes of people in all places. Yeah, so there's the inadequacies of economic development, traditional economic development. Growth. Some people don't benefit from the fruits of growth. So community wealth building is a corrective to that. It considers wealth, investment flows with a greater emphasis on ownership. And that's what's driving it here in Scotland. That's what's driving it in the US. Also, we share so much in terms of the response to climate emergency, right? 8 years left to get sorted, and obviously the pandemic. So that's a key similarity. The second thing is, and you'll hear from a number of the speakers, de-industrialization. Our own country has suffered under that de-industrialization that so many communities have suffered from, the failure to make the transition to new economic futures. And of course, community wealth building reimagines a different economic future for well-being, for justice, where we all have a genuine stake in the economy, and not just thinking there's another big factory that's going to come along to solve all our problems. So de-industrialization is a common theme. The second thing is deep-rooted issues of poverty, class, and race, particularly in the States. Long-standing issues of poverty, class injustice, and racial injustice. And of course, questions of ownership and giving those people more of a stake in the economy is kind of key, and we share that. The fourth area that's similar is the failing of regeneration, part failing of regeneration, or what they call it in the States, revitalisation. The transfer payments, the handouts, we'll give you some money to be better. We know that doesn't truly work because it didn't create the system change. So there's an appreciation that regeneration or revitalisation is not enough. And final thing that's sort of common is the municipality, the local level. That's important. National's important, but also this local thing. So there's 5 elements: the inadequacy of economic development, the de-industrialization, deep-rooted problems of poverty, class and race, failings of regeneration or revitalisation, and this municipal level. It's worth saying that whilst community wealth building might be a left agenda, a Democrat agenda, or a centre-left agenda in Scotland, it's also getting picked up. It's also getting picked up in Republican areas, yeah, and getting picked up on not just red areas, but also green areas and blue areas too. So it's not just a partisan political project. It's got a bigger universal feel to it all. So in the US, and you'll hear from Sarah, my good colleague Sarah at the Democracy Collaborative, on the origins of community wealth building. The Democracy Collaborative, who Sarah works for and who me and Sarah work for, in a sense, they came up with the term. So we'll hear about what actually originated, and also particularly what happened in Cleveland, Ohio, the first area that kind of started to do it full toot, if you like. And TDC remain thought leaders in snowballing the movement across the US, but also elsewhere. And there's 4 things that TDC are doing at the moment that has parallels to the work in Scotland. First, they're growing networks of people that are doing community wealth building across the US. And that is hoping to be expanded and formalised in coming months. So there's networks of organisations, people doing community wealth building, and TDC create that to an extent. Importantly, they also are involved in deeper work, akin to those pilot areas that are doing community wealth building in Scotland, the 5 areas plus North Ayrshire that we've talked about before. There's similar work going on in the US. And of course, the 3 areas today represent that deeper work, but there's also other areas too that are also doing that deeper dive community wealth building activity, the action planning work, if you like. The third thing that TDC are doing is it's linking to other policy areas, like kind of what we're doing in Scotland, to climate change, to federal government departments, including in America, the Economic Development Administration. That's a federal body. As well as the Housing and Urban Development federal body too. So it's linking in with those wider policy areas, similar to what's happening in Scotland, vis-a-vis the links that the Community Wealth Building team has with other policy areas in the Scottish Government. And the other thing that's worth noting is that the Democracy Collaborative are developing draft federal community wealth building legislation, which is linking in with people in Congress. And TDC have an internal team working on that draft legislation at the moment, and that will be produced by the end of this year. So that has parallels too with the Scottish plans for legislation. So I'm just going to wind up. So today you'll hear about origins of community wealth building from my colleague Sarah. You'll hear from Nika Ann and from Julie from Chicago, Somerville and Meadville respectively. And just to say finally, there's a few things I just want to pick out in terms of just little cues in your head really about similarities and differences here. A few points just to mention. In the States, the problems are perhaps worse. Yeah. Racial injustice is long-standing, deep and ingrained, and we don't have that form. We've got injustice, but not like that. That's a different ballpark of injustice, right? So, yeah. De-industrialization is worse there. We think our Motherwell and all that was bad. It's worse there. Yeah, the de-industrialization. There is no big social safety net in the States. If you fall through, you fall right through. You may think our welfare state has got holes in it. Well, it's got a lot more holes there. You fall right through. We've got NHS. So the social safety net, the how far you can drop is not as far as you can drop in the States. Also, wealth extraction from communities is stronger there. the forces of ownership and extracting of wealth from communities is much stronger than it is in Scotland. And the final thing to say in terms of the states that's maybe worse is that antipathy towards state intervention can be stronger. We kind of say, oh, well, states coming in, be all right. Well, they're a bit annoying sometimes, but they're all right. Yeah. There is sometimes deep antipathy towards state intervention, more of a laissez-faire state, get out of my way. Yeah. There is, though, also, I think states, cities, counties have more power. They've got more power on tax and laws. Administrations can be more political. Elections can see change in officials, not like here. In terms of the culture traditions that kind of help drive community wealth building in the States, social and racial solidarity brings a stronger community drive, perhaps. There's more of a collective sense of injustice that means that there's more of a solid connection, not like our traditional community involvement sectors, but stronger in terms of the bonds that tie communities, particularly those that suffer racial injustice. There's less ideological adherence to ideas, to ideology. There's more of a let's do it. Yeah, less inertia there. There's more more experimentation. US are more likely to say like hell yeah. We're more likely to say I been. So there's more of a experimental zeal in the States than there's here. Anyway, that's just some opening thoughts to kind of tune your brain to this sort of thing. I hope you have a great. I hope you enjoy everything. I'll pass you back to Liz, who will introduce Sarah.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Neil. That's really, really interesting and setting a really good scene for today. Fascinating. I think crystallises some of what we're probably aware of and fills in some gaps as well. So really useful way to start the session. So to build on what Neil's just covered, I'm really delighted to welcome Sarah Mckinley, Director of European Programmes and Next System Project Representation with the Democracy Collaborative, which has really been at the vanguard in championing and influencing community wealth building in the United States over many years. Sarah is going to introduce us to the collaborative's work around community wealth building and also to Cleveland, Ohio, where it all began. So great to have you here, Sarah. Welcome. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you so much, Neil. Can folks see me? I'm not used to the format of
See you fine.
Okay, Teams. Okay, great. I am going to attempt to share my screen. I feel like that's the beginning of every embarrassing Zoom, virtual story, but I'm going to try. Can you see this? I see Liz nodding, so that's a good sign. I'm going to try and start from the beginning here, if I can. Oh, have to unplug there. All right, let's try this.
Perfect.
Can you see my notes, though? Is everyone seeing my notes? Nope. All right, good. So you can see my screen. First of all, thank you so much, Neil. Thank you so much to Liz and Elaine and Allison at the EDAS team. Thank you so much to everyone who's here, and in particular to our good colleagues and partners from across the US who are doing this work. And really, I'm most excited to be here with all of you who are really doing the work day in and day out in your communities across Scotland. It's always exciting to learn about it and hear about it from Neil and others. And let me just say that Scotland and the work that you're doing in Scotland is always sort of, to us, inspirational and very much sort of driving the leading edge of this work. I will say, Neil, I really appreciated your opening comments. I thought it was thoughtful and helpful to sort of connect some dots, because in many ways it can seem like these places are very different, and of course they are very different, and yet there are things that we are connected by. But I will say some of those huge obstacles that Neil highlighted, just hearing them is so overwhelming, and it makes me think, well, if you can do it in the US, you can do it anywhere. So you can certainly do this in Scotland, and you already are, and I'm excited to hear. So I'm going to spend a little bit, about 10 minutes, speaking about the Democracy Collaborative and the origins of community wealth building and the community wealth building movement, and how they address these 5 different areas that Neil mentioned around failure of traditional economic development, the uneven and unequal nature of economic growth in our current system, our period of crises, such as climate and de-industrialization, poverty, ingrained poverty, and ingrained inequalities. So just to start a little bit about the Democracy Collaborative, to give you some more context about where we're coming from. We are a US-based research and design lab, that's what we're calling ourselves now, for the democratic economy. And we work transatlantically, so we work both in the US and the UK to present ideas and visions, lift up models and best practices, and build pathways to a new and more sustainable political economic system. So why do we talk about the democratic economy? What do we mean when we talk about that? Well, we believe that true human flourishing requires that people have control of their own economic futures in addition to their social conditions. We believe that democracy cannot reside only in the political realm through an increasingly non-representative electoral system, specifically in the case of the United States, but broadly in our Western democracies. So we must now also democratize our economy. And we believe that community wealth building is the vehicle of doing that in place by broadening ownership and control of our local economies so that wealth is not extracted out of our communities, but recirculates within it to the benefit of the people who live there and ultimately to the benefit of the planet as well. This is the work that you're all doing. I know you've all talked about it, but that sort of contextualizes our approach to this and how we came to it. So where did it all begin? The Democracy Collaborative first articulated the frame of community wealth building in the mid-2000s, so gosh, nearly 20 years ago, as a means of connecting various known strategies that have been applied and implemented in communities for generations, from cooperatives to community land trusts, all the things you see on this slide here, combining all of those, connecting those into a coherent approach to developing local economies. Community wealth building takes these familiar forms and brings them together in new settings as solutions to our new and growing challenges in the modern era. It integrates them into a network strategy that reconfigures our local economic institutions on the basis of greater democratic ownership, participation, and control. We think of community wealth building as a new way of thinking about economic development, a new way of doing economic development, not just a fringe project here or a side effort here, but a new way of thinking holistically around economic development, around poverty alleviation, and around wealth creation and accumulation. So this was first all put to test, this frame all linked together in Cleveland, Ohio in about 2010. So this is a picture of a neighborhood in East Cleveland, again around 2010. And sadly, this is an all too familiar sight in much of post-industrial urban America and indeed around the globe. But as Neil was saying, the scale and the impact of disinvestment and deindustrialization that results in these kinds of scenes is much greater in places like Cleveland than many other places. So by the time this photo was taken around 2010, the large private for-profit corporations such as the Fortune 500 companies, the Rockefellers and so forth, that had made Cleveland a huge boom town in the roaring 1920s and through the war era, they had fled. They had fled Cleveland in pursuit of cheaper operating costs and ultimately in search of sort of globalized wealth creation, and left behind essentially a trail of disinvestment, deindustrialization, community devastation, infrastructure that was no longer applicable and really decaying and falling into disrepair, empty factories, empty houses, half-empty schools, hospitals, public buildings in disrepair. At that point, Cleveland was in fact second only to places like Detroit in terms of poverty statistics and some of the other sort of quote unquote horror stories that you hear. So half of all children in Cleveland were living below the federal poverty line. And at that point, it was one of the poorest cities in America. But here's Chris Brown. Chris Brown is a young African-American man who grew up in that neighborhood that we just saw a picture of in Cleveland. At that time, the median income was $8,000 a year for a family. And Chris was at one time a drug dealer and served time in prison. But now, Chris, as you can see from this photo, is an employee owner of what are known as the Evergreen Cooperatives. That came about when a local collaboration of institutions and community groups came together to ask a key question. And that key question was that despite all the blight, despite all the scenes like we just saw on that last slide, there was huge wealth in the city that wasn't benefiting places like East Cleveland, people like Chris and his community. Specifically, just a few miles away, you can actually see in the next slide, it's really just 3 miles away. There was largely untapped economic power of large institutions like the Cleveland Clinic hospitals, Case Western Reserve University, and university hospitals. These institutions together amounted in $3 billion a year in annual procurement of goods and services, but none of that was being connected to the communities like we just saw. So this collaboration of institution and community-based organization reached out to the Democracy Collaborative to see if our frame of community wealth building, of broadening ownership of the economy, could make a difference in a place like Cleveland, in specifically a neighborhood like East Cleveland, and could work to rewire the Cleveland economy to benefit those who had been cut out of the kind of economic generation that those anchor institutions were producing. So together, this collaborative created a network of green, employee-owned cooperatives that draw upon the purchasing power of those large public and nonprofit anchor institutions. So again, you can see in the forefront, these greenhouses are actually one of that's Green City Growers, one of the 3 initial cooperatives. And just in the background, you can see sort of the skyline of downtown Cleveland, just a few miles away, where all those institutions were. Or are. So the 3 original Evergreen Cooperatives now employ over 200 people locally, all of whom earn a living wage and have the opportunity to share in the profits of the company. Recently, I believe it was just before COVID, actually, the Cooperative Laundry, which was one of the first cooperatives to be developed, beat out Sodexo, a large multinational corporation, for the full laundry contract of the Cleveland Clinic, the largest hospital in the region. In the process of winning that bid, winning that full contract, the cooperative laundries were actually able to buy out Sodexo's plant in the Cleveland area and give each of those employees in that formerly Sodexo plant a raise and fast track them to become employee owners in the cooperatives, also doubling the size of the Evergreen Cooperative laundry itself. Nothing was lost. Not a single job at all was lost in that transition. And in fact, there was great improvement to the employees who had formerly been with Sodexo. The only thing that was lost was some profit for the shareholders of Sodexo. So what distinguishes this model? It's not just the cooperative aspect of it, which is hugely important. It's not just the fact that it creates stability for individual employers. It's the fact that it is designed to benefit not just those individual employees who work there, but also the community as a whole. It is part of an integrated network strategy. So the cooperatives themselves are networked together by a community controlled, there's a community board that oversees a holding company that gives local stakeholders a say in whether the cooperatives can or cannot be sold or moved or their functioning can be changed within the community. So this holding entity also receives a percentage of the profits from each cooperative that then recirculates and provides funds back into the network to scale and build additional enterprises to serve the community. And in 2018, Evergreen launched the Fund for Employee Ownership, which acquires local firms that are about to close or be sold or shut down and converts them to employee ownership and brings them into the supportive network so that jobs are not lost and so that those enterprises stay within the community and produce benefit to the people living there. So what the Evergreen Cooperatives is doing, it's recirculating, multiplying, and growing wealth locally for the people who create that wealth in the first place, as well as the people who live in the communities where those companies are housed. It supports the well-being of these communities, and it reverses the long-term economic decline and disinvestment as we saw previously on the slides. But now, in this moment of multiple and compounding crises that Neil laid out, we truly believe it's time to scale community wealth building beyond just these really exciting and powerful examples such as Evergreen, to actually become not just a project on the side, not just a fringe idea, but actually the way that we think about and the way that we go about economic development and building our local economies. And that's why it's so important that local government, local authorities, people like yourselves, bring to bear the full weight of their budgets, their planning, and their authority benefits to bring to bear that for the benefit of place to build these kinds of collaborative economic activities, to build this kind of cooperative economy that we need to transition to the future that is the only future we can live sustainably in from here. So thank you so much for your work. I'm really excited to hear from our guests because they're really doing the hard work, rolling up their sleeves in the communities that they're a part of. And I'm really excited to hear your questions. So thanks so much for having me. And now I will try and stop sharing if I can. Let's see here.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was really, really excellent. I know it was a bit of a whistle-stop tour for you, covering a lot of information in a relatively short time, but I think for the benefit of our audience, it gave us a really good insight and introduction into really where everything started for community wealth building in Ohio, Cleveland. I'm looking at the chat box right now, and I'm not seeing any burning questions. Some comments. I think Mark was commenting. Mark Landon was commenting early on around, actually, are there, are the differences between Scotland and the US perhaps as marked as perhaps we set out at the beginning? Yeah, I think we would all agree that things are certainly moving, not necessarily moving in the right direction here, but that's why community wealth building is so important. Why we're trying so hard to get this movement growing and activated and making a difference. If there aren't any obvious questions at this stage, I'm going to propose, just because I'm mindful of time, and we've only got another hour, I'm going to move on. And please do think about some comments or other points you might want to add to the chat box as we progress. But maybe you want to hear from the other speakers as well, so so that you can get some sense of what's going on as a totality across a range of areas in the States. Oh, I've got one question for you, Sarah, just very quickly come in. And it's just Margaret McSporran who's asking, what were the challenges of getting the private monies engaged?
Well, that's a long conversation, so I don't want to go down too deeply that rabbit hole. And I'm sure when we hear from our practitioner presenters that they can speak to that as well. But I'll just say very quickly, first of all, it was very intentional with the Evergreen Cooperatives to focus actually on not-for-profit and public entities, hospitals, universities, and so forth, because they actually have a mandate to serve and they actually receive specific public and tax benefits to deliver their work. So there is you can pull at the mission, first of all, and there is in fact a mutual self-interest for them to be able to deliver certain benefits in place. So for example, just very quickly with hospitals, for example, we talked a lot about the social determinants of health. And so in fact, in addressing issues like poverty, like disinvestment, like access and inequality, if you were to address those things upstream, at the end of the day, it actually benefits your operating as a hospital system. Same with universities. If you address some of these issues upstream so that they don't potentially lead to the societal challenges that perhaps can disrupt and cause issue to your student body, to your faculty, to things of that nature. It's really in your interest to think about these things. Plus, you also have a mission to serve. So we deliberately started with institutions that were mission oriented, that we could have those conversations with, that were willing to think in that way. And then we were also able to have conversations that actually show that in fact, it is beneficial to their operating to actually think in different ways to address these issues proactively rather than sort of waiting until they had to deal with the consequences of sort of not acting, if you will, or not being more intentional with regard to their economic impacts.
Okay, so thanks very much, Sarah. And I think it's interesting too, as well, isn't it, in the examples that you gave, where when you looked at all the investors and the private companies and the Rockefellers, as you mentioned it, that had really built Cleveland, you know, the risk when they left was that, I mean, look what happened, look at the consequences. So that's why the kind of public bodies are so integral to all of this. And of course, that's the approach that's being taken here as well. Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. I hope you're able to stay for the remainder of the session.
Oh, absolutely. I'm thrilled to be here. I wouldn't miss it.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so we're going to move on now to our case studies for the afternoon. And I'd like to introduce Anna Tate, who's Professor with Rhode Island School of Design. Anne is a professor and activist, and she will talk about Somerville, Boston, a growing and economically buoyant city, highlighting the challenges of gentrification in Somerville, the problems of wealth accumulation and extraction, and how community wealth building is working to ensure more people can enjoy a genuine stake in the economic success of the city. Anne, delighted again to have you here. From across the pond. So really looking forward as well to hearing what you have to tell us about your experience. So over to you. Oh, and I think you're on mute at the moment. So we just need to make sure you're unmuted so we can hear you. Oh, Alison, our help in the background, are you able to help with this?
Yep, and the unmute button is your top right of your screen. Beside the leave button, there's a microphone.
No, still got you on mute.
And you might have a taskbar, actually. I have a taskbar that sort of floats in the middle, and there's a unmute button there.
Can you hear us? Can you hear us? Okay. Yeah. Oh, got you.
Thank you. That was not there. Suddenly it came up. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I will, does that bar also let me share screen?
Yes, and there's a little box with an arrow in it.
Share tray,
Yep,
right. Okay, that's good. All right, excuse me 1 second. Here we go. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, can see your screen, but not any words on your slides.
We see purple mountains majesties, man.
No, that's the wrong screen. Sorry about this, as usual, Sarah said.
Technology is wonderful when it works.
All right. I will try to get out of this and see how I can do this. That's unfortunate because the screen I have is not on there.
Are you able to speak to, or is it quite important that we see the slides?
I can speak, but you don't seeing any of my slides. Is that right?
Anne, if you could send the slides to me, and I'll fire them on to. Do
you want to skip over me and come back?
Yeah, we'll skip over, and you send the slides to me.
Okay.
You've got my email address, and I'll fire them on to Alison. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Do that now, and we'll move on to the next speaker. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Just need to find my notes here. Sorry, I seem to have lost my note as to who we have next. Then we're going to bring on Neka on Wurizike, who's a consultant with the Office of Equity and Racial Justice. And Neka is going to speak to us about Chicago, Illinois. And though I'm sure many of you know, but Chicago is the third largest city in the USA. And Neka is going to highlight the growing role of community wealth building and Chicago's community wealth building strategy in addressing long-standing poverty inequality and racial injustices. And Anika, are you okay to, yeah, I can see you've got your slides up, so you're okay just to step in here. Many thanks for doing that.
Cool.
Okay, over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Liz. Hi, everyone. I'm Nneka Onwuzurike, and I'm an advisor for the City of Chicago in the mayor's office on our community wealth building strategy that we've been leading for about 2 years now. So I'll just be mindful of time and just share a couple of slides to kind of talk to you a little bit about the evolution of how we got here and what we have looking forward. So, this has been named a bit already, but a lot of this is in response to the massive racial wealth and health gap that we're seeing in the United States broadly, but also specifically in Chicago. So you can see a few statistics here. I imagine nothing too surprising, but just to give you all context, Chicago, Illinois is the 3rd largest city in the country, has about 2.7 million people in the city. About 30% are white, 30% Latinx or Hispanic, and 30% Black, as well as a really vibrant and diverse immigrant community. And so a lot of the programs that we are around our community wealth building are targeted at the racial wealth gap, because there is a huge disparity in what we're seeing in terms of wealth with Black and Latinx families. So just to point out a few statistics, the average white-owned business value is more than 12 times that of Black-owned businesses in Chicago. You can see the disparities in home ownership rates as well as home ownership value between the communities. There are massive health disparities where a white Chicagoan lives 8.8 years longer on average than a Black Chicagoan. And in the United States, we have a long history of redlining, where the investment, just really discriminatory investment practices. And so oftentimes, people talk about that being a thing of the past as a part of our history. But, this report from WBEZ came out about 2 years ago that basically showcased that redlining still happens today. So for every $1 banks loaned in Chicago's white neighborhoods, they invested just 12 cents in the city's Black neighborhoods and 13 cents in Latinx neighborhoods. So that's just a few data points just to give you a snapshot of the large disparities. So Mayor Lori Lightfoot is the mayor of the city of Chicago. She came in 2019. She was elected. And when she was elected, she named that equity was going to be one of her core focus areas. So she appointed the first ever chief equity officer for the city of Chicago, her name is Candace Moore. And one of the things that she was tasked with was, thinking about what equitable economic development could look like in the city. That was a huge focus for the mayor. And so there are a number of initiatives that the mayor has launched and is championing, from working on programs to develop a pipeline of developers of color, so that when we are doing these big developments, that we're being able to really build that pipeline for folks of color. Thinking about extending corporate footprints on the south and west side. There's a lot around adaptive reuse of buildings and vacant land. And one of the things that I think our team noticed in the Office of Equity and Racial Justice is, while these initiatives are important, that there is still a huge gap here, right? When we're thinking about how can we really start to close the racial wealth gap and shift economic power, right? That when we do this work, it's not just about how do we create, I feel like oftentimes when I first started with the city, folks were talking about wealth building programs, and a lot of the ways in which they were defining building wealth in these low income, low wealth, Black and brown communities was around jobs, right? Are we bringing jobs to the community? Are the developers of color having opportunities to actually be able to bid against these RFPs? And it was missing a huge analysis around, well, who's actually owning and controlling the assets in folks' community? And so as everyone on this call is familiar with the community wealth building framework and model, we essentially decided that we needed to be able to impart new visions and new strategies and new tools to focus on community wealth building. So for us, community wealth building, which in large part was taken from or borrowed from the Democracy Collaborative research over many, many years. And we knew that we wanted to focus on models of local, democratic, and shared ownership and control of community assets. And we started to bucket it in 4 different ways. That we wanted to look at business ownership, home ownership, land stewardship, and commercial real estate, and really start to do a landscape analysis of what does it look like here in Chicago? Who are the players working in this space already? What does the pipeline of projects look like? Because it had been really, underfunded and under acknowledged. The city didn't really have much of a focus on it. And so one of the things through a lot of conversation with community members was getting to the point where we could also start to get industry specific. So you can see within business ownership, we selected 4 industry focus areas. Industrial manufacturing, we talked a lot about de-industrialization, and Chicago has definitely been impacted by that. Food and beverage, which is a huge industry, especially on the South Side. Cannabis. So cannabis is a very growing industry with a lot of racial inequities. And so we see that as a huge opportunity to come in on the early end, if you will, to try and embed a community wealth building strategy so that Black and brown people are actually benefiting from this industry that is now becoming legalized. And then lastly, the service sector. So most of the cooperatives in Chicago existing already are in the service sector. And so being able to support those as well. So these were kind of our focus areas, and we've been doing a lot of research, both nationally, internationally, and trying to compare to see like where Chicago really fits in this. But I think a big question for us too with all of this work is that, the best models that we've seen have been really community driven, right? So like, what is the role of the city in this work, right? To not be able to co-opt this movement, to co-opt the work that's happening. And so we kind of landed in these 4 areas, which I think mimics a lot of the things I've heard on this call already, is education and awareness, city levers, city policies, and investment partnerships. So with education and awareness, I think one of the first things we noticed was that we're not all speaking the same language when it comes to wealth. When it comes to wealth building, everyone has a very different definition of what those things mean. Household wealth building versus community wealth building. And that often like stops the conversation very early and doesn't even allow us to go deep into thinking about creative policy solutions. So the first thing was figuring out what is our education and awareness strategy, both internally with the mayor's office and city departments. So we'll be launching a series of trainings, as well as externally. There's a lot of community members who want to know more about this work, but don't really have the ability to do so. The second was city levers. So, there's a number of existing programs in our various departments, Department of Housing, Department of Transit, Department of Planning and Development, that exist, but don't really have a community wealth building analysis or approach to them. So how can we start to line up, what are some of the existing programs that are kind of some easy wins, if you will, where if we can just incorporate a community wealth building incentive into them, that'll be able to drive some of this work in the city. Community wealth building policies, of course, there's a number of barriers that currently exist. And so trying to figure out what are some of the policies that we need to create across the board to make it easier to both start and scale a lot of these models. And then lastly, investment partnerships. And so this is kind of, with some of the funding coming from the federal government under President Biden's Build Back Better agenda, the city of Chicago was able to allot $15 million towards a community wealth building pilot project. And so we're now in the beginning phases of designing what that project will look like. But these are kind of 3 things that we know we want to focus on and want to prove out. And so we see this truly as being a pilot, hopefully being able to bolster this movement and be able to bring in additional dollars from philanthropy as well as the private sector. But we want to do 3 things. One, we want to prove the power of a community-led democratic governance model. So, we see the process being a product as well, right? That the process of how we get there is very much something that we think it can be replicated. So what does it look like for city government to truly share power or shift power with community members to be able to make decisions? The second is the power of a strong community wealth building ecosystem. So that is something that community members have named loud and clear for us, that oftentimes government is going in and kind of selecting these like big pilot projects and doing big ribbon cuttings and groundbreakings. And it's just, 1 or 2 things, right? Whereas what we really need to be doing is building up the ecosystem so that the folks who are doing the legal support, the financial support, the actual business incubation and acceleration, those players have the capacity to be able to self-sustain this work once government, which sometimes often does, moves on to the next thing, right? So supporting and bolstering up that ecosystem. And then the third thing is having some proof points. So being able to pick 2 or 3 large-scale community wealth building projects. And there's a number of them that are in the pipeline right now across the business, land, and home ownership space to be able to figure out what can we do over the next 3 to 4 years so that 4 years from now, when we've spent all this government funding, we have some big proof points that we can point to further shift policy and be able to put some of this support in our actual annual city budget. So that's a little bit about where we're at with everything. And I'll just pause there.
Nick, I can see some people on different screens, and there was much clapping going on in case you missed it, as there has been throughout this session so far. I think everyone's presentations have been really well received, and such really fascinating insights there into what can happen when there's a real build of momentum and willingness to really kind of strategically look at, a big push on this with the investment behind it at city level. I was in Chicago in 2006, and I was visiting on a study visit, and that was around social enterprise. And I remember at the time being kind of blown away by how, innovative and forward thinking the city was at that stage. So it's fantastic to see that this is built even further at this stage. So thank you so much for that. I am conscious there are quite a lot of questions coming in and comments in the chat box, but I would like to move on to our speaker, Anne, who has been waiting in the wings. Before we take some of those, we'll try and group some of those if possible. And great, I think we've got our technology working now for you, Anne. Hooray!
Yeah.
That's great. I'm just gonna move on to you just to remind people of who you are. You're a professor with Rhode Island School of Design, but you're also an activist, and you're going to describe to us, tell us a bit about Somerville in Boston and the experience of community building there. Okay, so over to you, Anne. Can you see your slides okay? Everything's okay? It's working?
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
That looks great, and I apologize for the snafu, and I was really interested to hear NECA's descriptions of Chicago, and it's very inspiring to think about where we could get. Somerville is at the beginning of this process. I've been working with Neil and Sarah since the summer. Last spring, the mayor of Somerville approached me saying that he recognized the position that the city was in, which I'll elaborate a little bit, and that he wanted to take advantage of this moment and drive some of the investment that was coming into the city into ways to build social capital and human capital rather than simply building infrastructure, which we also need a great deal of. So to tell you a little bit about Somerville, it's described here as a very up and coming city full of resources and possibilities, but having been here for 25 years, in the time that I've been here, that was not the case. So it's rapidly changing. It fits the mold of a post-industrial city that was down on its heels for many years. You can see a few of the statistics here. The population's about 80,000. The poverty rate in 2019 was 11%. It was going down. Median household income is enormous. I mean, it's $90-some thousand. And the median property value has just gone off the charts. But that's in the last 20 years. It's 6 or 7 times what it was when I came into the city, it seems. So to the next slide. We also have very progressive representation in Washington, including Elizabeth Warren, who is behind all these ideas. So that's really great. Just to show you where we are, Somerville is the light gray in this image, and the city, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the city center is just directly below it. And there's a green line with T marks on it. That's an entirely new transit line that is going in and should open up this spring and summer. And there's an orange T, which is also a new transit line. So the city has become recently the beneficiary of enormous amounts of transportation and investment, which we as activists fought very, very hard to get. Next slide, please. So the population's 80,000, and in 1940 it was 100,000. It's only 4 square miles, so it's a very dense city. There are more than 50 languages spoken in the public schools. It has historically been an immigrant and working class community, but that is rapidly being displaced by young tech workers. As I said, the median age is now 31, which is really shocking to me. Next slide. So for many years, we were known as Slummerville. To give you an idea, the housing you can see is very dense, working class, wood frame housing in general. And these graphs you don't need to pay a lot of attention to, but it's basically that Cambridge, in 2010, Cambridge was spending almost twice as much per capita as Somerville. Somerville was very, very dependent on state aid to meet its budget. The slide at the top, the blue line is Cambridge at the far end, and the red line at the other end is Somerville. So these are adjacent communities that, and the statistic is jobs per square mile. So we were super low on jobs, very, very high on residential housing and affordable housing. It's a place where lots of students chose to live who couldn't afford to live in Cambridge, particularly after Cambridge killed rent control in 1994. It also became a place where creatives lived because it was cheap. Next slide. Consequently, the first thing that happened is that the city became a very vibrant place for innovators and startups and young people because of the low rent. And this is just we have farmers markets, and the community and the Arts Council and the mayor supported these things that didn't cost the city an enormous amount, but contributed a great deal to the cachet of the city. So we have a thing called Porch Fest, where people play music on their porches. The Honk Festival, which is street bands from all over the country come. And then weekly farmers markets. So we have this creativity and this energy and all these young people, but we also have the pressure now of this being a place where tech companies want to be, which is great. But so there's now a huge influx of money and jobs coming into the city. I was on a meeting recently where a young person said, well, we have enough jobs in Somerville. What we need now is housing. And I thought, well, in 20 years, we have turned this equation completely upside down from where it was before. So that's a big success, but it carries with it enormous risks. And this was why when I spoke with the mayor, I went to the Democracy Collaborative and said, we need to figure out a structure for tapping these income streams that are coming in now and making sure that it doesn't just lead to houses all costing $1 million and no benefit for the community that's in place. Next slide. Also contributing to that boom was the fact that MIT and Harvard are immediately adjacent. They're not in our town, but Tufts is in our town. And the graph there is just the rise in life science employment in Massachusetts versus the country, and in Massachusetts versus the sort of other high-tech states. So a few people saw the opportunity to grab this and to really try to make the community welcoming to these industries. And now we have the new problem of what do we do that now that we have all this happening? Next. So the community wealth building strategies that we're looking at for Somerville have to do with harnessing this creativity and the energy and the kind of desire to create a more collective and more equal economy in the city. So we're talking with, we now have a new mayor, so we've also been in a transition in this period after almost 20 years of the old mayor. We have a new mayor, and we're working with her to create a network of support for cooperatives and startups as one of the strategies. Working with anchor institutions, as Sarah has proven, is such an important thing, and we're figuring out what kinds of jobs and relationships could be spun out of those institutional organizations. There are a lot of jobs coming into Somerville now, but there isn't an easy way for residents to get them. So looking at a jobs clearinghouse where there's a closer relationship to supporting the people in the city. Again, the biggest problem for new companies, for residents, for businesses is the enormously rising rents. So the land trust strategy is key in Somerville. We had a group beginning to start that, but the work with the Democracy Collaborative is going to give them a lot of support for that. We're also looking at land trusts, not just for housing, but for commercial space, and looking for inclusionary zoning, which would be not just for housing as it's typically been used, but also for startup space for companies and businesses. So that's some of the mechanisms that we are working with. And as I said, we're just at the beginning of this. Next slide. There has been a huge amount of new development in the city. I was very involved with getting this project called Assembly Square off the ground. The community, it's an interesting short story. The community fought the development of big boxes on the site and said they wanted intensive mixed use development with transit, and ultimately we got it, and that is what has tipped us into this new position where suddenly we have more coming in than we kind of know how to deal with yet. But we have all this development, but it's not clear that the jobs there are automatically going to residents. So that's another piece of working on these linkages. Next. And then we have a very strong ecosystem for green tech startups through something called Greentown Labs. We're looking to study that model and expand it for other companies in Somerville. Next. And finally, how do we support small retailers? There's a lot of pressure in all this new development where all the cheap retail space is disappearing and becoming subject to the pressures of chain retail. This is a project called Bow Market, which was a garage, was an auto body shop, and has been repurposed for all very small retail boutique spaces, and with food stuff on the first floor and other things on the second floor, and open dining. And it's linked to an area that's now where the farmers market is. So it's a very busy and very successful new development. So to sum up, in Somerville, we're very excited to be working with the Democracy Collaborative. It is a perfect place for aligning the commitments and the vision of the community with the resources and the experience that the Democracy Collaborative builds for how do we take this tiger that we have by the tail, take this massive amount of new growth, and channel it to places where it's really building capacity for the community and for the citizens, and not just a kind of corporate takeaway. So, which is a problem in this country. So I'll end with that, and thank you very much for your patience, and I'm happy to participate in questions.
Thanks very much, Anne. Anne, are you able to stay on beyond our last speaker? Because I think what we'll do is we'll take the questions. I'm just trying to gather some at the side here through the chat box, but if we can take them at the end, I think that would be helpful. So thank you. Again, really brought to life, I think, what's happening in Somerville and in that particular part of the United States. And again, just a good contrast, I think, to previous examples, much bigger city to kind of a smaller town, and yet still the willingness there to really make the most of the wealth that's really being generated at the moment in that area. So it's great to have these contrasting examples. I'd like to move on now to our final speaker this afternoon, and that's Julie Wilson, who's Associate Professor of Communication Arts at Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania. Meadville is a small rural town, and Julie will explore what community wealth building offers. Am I saying that correctly? Is it Meadville or Meadville? Just correct me if I'm wrong. Julie, I don't know if
Meadville.
Meadville, apologies for that. So Meadville, what community wealth building offers in its fight back against de-industrialization and lack of opportunity through the building of community ownership assets to create a local economy that works more effectively for local people and communities. So over to you, Julie, for this final example, building on what we've heard so far.
Thank
and
you.
again, do you have slides that you're sharing with us? Let's just double check.
I do, but it's telling me I need permission to start sharing. So maybe I will have Allison has mine.
Alison, are you able to do that for us?
Yes, coming right up. Cool. Just bear with me, please.
Okay.
I think we're doing pretty well considering, you know, we're in Scotland and you're over over the Atlantic there. Not done too badly.
No, it's all good.
Great.
Cool.
Okay, that looks good from where I'm sitting. So
excellent. Okay, thanks so much. I just want to thank Liz and Allison for all the help, and to Neil and Sarah for inviting me to be here and part of this inspiring program. I'm Julie. I'm actually no longer, I have joined the Great Resignation to like focus on community work more full-time and or in the organizing work that you'll hear about today. So this is Meadville, Pennsylvania. We're going from the 3rd largest city in the US to a kind of maybe smallish mid-sized city, Somerville to Meadville. Next slide. Meadville is population of about 13,000 people. It's predominantly white. A lot of times when people say that I'm in Pennsylvania, if you're familiar with the geography of the United States, they think East Coast, but Meadville is decidedly not East Coast. We are Rust Belt, more Midwestern, Northern Appalachia, if that means anything to you. And as you can see from the demographics, we're pretty poor. Like we are, sorry, hold on really quick. Just to give you some context, the numbers that are in the parentheses are statewide numbers. So you'll see that in terms of median household income, we are well below kind of median household income for the state. Our poverty rate is higher. Our unemployment rate is higher. To give you a sense of employment, right, most of the biggest sector of jobs comes from the fact that we are the county seat of Crawford County, which is a very conservative, rural, like Republican US politics, hardcore, Trump land. We are the county seat, so there is a lot of public sector work. We also have some anchor institutions in terms of a small liberal arts college where I used to work, and a independent community hospital, which we have managed to maintain amidst all of the healthcare battles and wars in our region. So we've heard a lot about de-industrialization from Neil and Sarah and others. People probably have never heard of Meadville. It's a small town, but if you talk to people that live here, we were the center of the world for a while, like known as the tool and die capital of the world, still talked about as Tool City. The lore goes that in the Great Depression, Meadville did not lose one job, that we were thriving and we did great. A fun fact is that the zipper was invented in Meadville. Allison, if you want to go to the next slide. The zipper was invented in Meadville, and yeah, and now it's not, it used to be made in Meadville, but not anymore, because like so many other towns, you know, the company closed up shop and went in search of cheaper labor and production costs. So Meadville today is, people talk about those shifts and the kind of decline from the capital of the world in terms of a deep trauma of a feeling stuck. In the work that I've done in the community, that the word trauma comes up all the time when talking to people that used to work in the factories and in manufacturing in particular. So yeah, so that's kind of again a very typical story, but it's a small town and a big part of our identity. A couple things is like Meadville is just poor, like we're really poor. And also, even though I said we're in a kind of very conservative rural area, weirdly progressive. Oh, Allison, will you go to the, I'm sorry, I gotta tell you to switch the slides. Yeah, okay, We're really progressive. So next slide, please. I would say that the biggest challenges that Meadville faces are pretty typical, and you probably could guess them, but a lack of living wage jobs. I think everyone's familiar with what's happened to the economy in terms of the rise of the service sector and poor in the gig economy, and not really living wage jobs. But in our town, where manufacturing was so important, you really feel it, and the unions are weak. And we continue to see local manufacturing shops being gobbled up. I recently had a great meeting with the head of the local steelworkers, and it was just interesting to hear the history. And his shop was recently bought by a big company out of Michigan. We have a affordable housing crisis, which I know is everywhere. 60% of Meadville households are rentals, though, so it's a majority renter town. There are absolutely no regulations protecting tenants, and I would say that goes the same for commercial tenants as well. All the property, both residential and commercial, are owned by absentee landlords. Many are slumlords. And just to give you a sense, there's been a lot of studies done on the rental population in Meadville, and over 50% of people are cost burdened, just meaning that they can't afford their homes and to eat. The other big problem that we're facing is just a lack of municipal capacity, I would say. Because a lot of changes in how our federal and state government work, we have a growing structural deficit and no flexibility in terms of how we can raise revenue. Pennsylvania is a weird state, and the only way that a city like Meadville can raise revenue is through raising property taxes, which is you can't just keep raising property taxes, but there's nothing else to do. And so that means that the city's constantly having to trim staff and resources, and is really just not equipped to address resident and business needs at all. And we do have some amazing assets in Meadville. We own a market house, which is the oldest market house in Pennsylvania, continuously operating. And we own a recreation center, which is amazing. And we have like 30 community gardens, and like there's all this beautiful stuff in the parks, but it's just really hard to maintain. Next slide, please. So I said we're poor, and I hope I've painted a picture of that, but I also think there's this weirdly progressive edge to Meadville. On the one hand, it's very conservative culturally and politically, and I think Neil and Sarah in their time with people in Meadville have seen that. But on the other hand, that there's this really progressive edge, like I said, that we do have these huge municipal assets that are publicly owned, all these gardens, and there's just a strong sense of pride in place and in the people there, and a kind of can-do spirit. So people just think like, we need to take care of each other, and this needs to get done, and we're just gonna do it. And it's people talk about being drawn and wanting to stay in Meadville because of that kind of weird sense of community connection and connection to place and to each other. Next slide. That's our beautiful market house. So community wealth building is on the rise in this little place called Meadville. And I think the reason that it is because of that weirdly progressive place-based civic spirit that exists. I know that sounds kind of amorphous, but it's hard to explain. And I think it's this kind of bootstrap, we can do this on our own, that's really nurtured the kind of cooperative efforts and values. And they have a foothold, and we're trying to build that out into a bigger ecosystem. Next slide, please. So, oh, can you go back one? Oh, there's one missing there. Okay, No worries. So I would say that there are two movements that have led us to where we are now. One is a very intentional, like cooperative development movement that started about 6 years ago. And Meadville currently has a Northwest PA investment cooperative, which is a real estate cooperative. And the idea is that people are going to buy a voting share, and then we're going to pool the resources and buy up the commercial properties, democratize ownership of land, but mostly focus on commercial buildings and support community-minded, socially minded entrepreneurs that can't access and like that might have ideas but can't get access to capital, much less afford to pay for the rehab to the building that the slumlord that owns it won't do and just says you take care of it. And then the other, we're also trying to democratize housing and ownership of housing through establishing a scattered site limited equity housing cooperative. And we're partnering with the city on that to basically, when they get properties, I think 25% of the houses in Meadville are blighted. And we're partnering with them to try to get them to turn over properties that they come into to us, and then we are going to put them in the cooperative. And this will be for low, I mean, most people in Meadville are low income, but, you know, just to give people that wouldn't have access to the benefits, the wealth building benefits of home ownership, can be a member of the cooperative and have a ownership stake in our housing. The other movement that I need to mention is that we have had a political movement to elect new municipal leadership, because the city was not supporting any of the cooperative movement or any kind of progressive democratization agenda, which is, there's just been a lot of work and organizing going on. So in 2019 and 2021, we took over our city council and elected, we have 4 out of 5 seats on city council, including the mayor. And through that work, we've also been able to get more people from the cooperative movement involved in our local authorities and like in other arms of city government. And really exciting that our market house is now recently been taken over by someone who's been a leader in the cooperative movement as well. So what we're learning with the help of the Democracy Collaborative, and I'll just say that I reached out to the Democracy Collaborative when it was clear that we were going to win the city council, because it just felt like there's just this huge opportunity, because there's just no money coming into Meadville. It's not like a big city, like there's just nothing. Everything feels so hard and broke from the government, and there's a lot of big political and economic divides like everywhere else. And so, hey, like what would happen if we could really get the municipality behind these new approaches to economic development? Could we kind of really start to get some legs under us and get a little bit, you know, more movement and more properties and get further along in the work. So next slide. All right. So the opportunities that the research we've been doing with Neil and Sarah that are kind of emerging are on this slide, but basically reframing our municipal assets like the market house as building blocks for community wealth and local enterprise. I don't think we here had really thought about the fact that these municipal things that we have were thought about them in terms of democratic ownership. And so that's been really helpful, and I think will help our leaders a lot and be part of the mix. We're the long-term, really hard stuff, but we want to revitalize our manufacturing sector through worker ownership. Meadville does have a successful history with ESOPs, but the tool and die manufacturing community is incredibly conservative. Like the unions are tend Republican, so, you know, so it's pretty complicated to build bridges across the kind of grassroots community and those spaces. Through the research we're hoping and the work that we're doing, anchor institutions in Meadville do collaborate, but they don't, it's more just communication. They don't actually try to do something. And I think the goal is hopefully to get them thinking about procurement and some of the community wealth building tools and what they could do in Meadville. and then establishing our cooperatives as vehicles for new economic development initiatives. There's a lot of private people, like anchor institutions and private entities. Everyone wants to revitalize Meadville, but like everyone's just going about it kind of on their own and in their own self-interest. And how could the cooperatives kind of emerge as the vehicle for that work? And there's just a lot going on at this particular moment. Next slide, and then I'll wrap up. So we have some big challenges. One of there's like cultural challenges, right? Neil and Sarah heard over and over again talking to people. We've always done things this way. Like people just don't want to change, and there's a lot of inertia in local government, but also in other kind of elite governing spaces. Like I keep saying, we're very poor. We don't have a lot of resources. There's not a lot of money coming in here. It's hard to figure out. I've been on the ground trying to do it. Other than our own money that we're putting into it, it's really hard to figure out how to resource this. There's also technical problems, like we have to hire lawyers and get technical assistance from outside of Meadville, not surprisingly, but having local technical assistance would be really helpful in bringing in some of the partners that we need if we want to get everyone on board, because they all work with local firms, accounting firms, and law firms. And then just educational. I think people have talked about that today. People don't know exactly what community wealth building is, what a cooperative is, and we just need to do a lot of popular kind of public education around that. So that's like resource challenges. And then the really hard one here is political, right? We are already looked at as socialists, and there's a narrative out there, and that we need to figure out how to change that narrative so that, we really believe community wealth building can do that and bring people together, as Sarah was saying earlier in her presentation. Like there are ways that this is clearly in the best interest of people who might want to scream socialism. And then also just leadership, right? Like right now we have municipal leadership, but there has been this like kind of movement building political edge to the work, and that's very threatening to a lot of people. And so we need to kind of figure out how we can bring more people in on leadership around some of these issues. So I'm very hopeful that the work that we are doing is going to help us take advantage of the opportunities and address some of these challenges and figure out how to do community wealth building in a teeny little town and that no one really knows about. So thank you so much and that's it.
Thanks so much, Julie. That was really good. Really, again, I can see all the clapping going on in the pictures that I can see here. So I think everyone's really appreciating, again, a very different example. You know, rural, small town, politically different. You know, completely different approach from the other examples that we've heard, but fascinating to hear how it's progressing and really the kind of drivers that are pulling that and pushing that. So I'm conscious of time, and don't worry, it was really important that we heard the contributions today. So more important, I think, to have a really kind of full you know, presentation from all of our speakers than perhaps to allow more time for polling, etc. But I do need to mention, just from the team in EDAS, we have put a poll in the chat box. We were going to make time for it today. I don't think we're going to have time for it just now, but I would ask that could everybody look at that poll if you can and respond to it. And if we run out of time, we will include it as part of our wrap up. You'll get the recording of the session, etc. But I'm keen to get on to some questions, which I've been trying to track in the chat box, and I'm going to try and do it in order. So if I can bring our kind of panel in. And I'd just like to raise the first question. This came in from Alison Cairns. And she was interested in the panel's thoughts on how to get the economists who shout the loudest to understand that social value, and that markets don't account for all the things that we value, and also how we can factor that in when we're transitioning to net zero and addressing climate change. So does that make sense to you? Just kind of really, how do you, you know, what are your thoughts on that? How do you get economists really to kind of switch their thinking, or what's your experience actually in dealing with economists around getting them to switch their thinking beyond, you know, just GDP and profit, etc. Who wants to go first? Sorry, I'm conscious we've got 5 people on the screen. And I would just, Sarah, would you like to go first, seeing as you were kind of first up speaking?
Sure. I mean, you know, you're always going to have sort of mainstream economists who are going to sort of say that this doesn't work. And although, to be honest, I do think that that is starting to shift. I think there's more and more global pressure, frankly, to consider things like the planet, environmental consequences, as well as social consequences. So I do think there is a shift change. And I do think, you know, for us, it's almost not really worth having the fight per se directly to sit around sort of yelling you're wrong and that doesn't work, and more to show that actually it makes a real difference in people's lives when you start to direct and connect these things intentionally, when you think about the economy as something that should be serving people's needs in place. And, you know, I'm stealing from Neil here, just because you asked me to go first, you know, returning the economy to the home, returning economy to the roots of economos as the Greek root for sort of the home and belonging to the home. So I think sort of for us, it's a show by doing, right? I think the proof of is in the pudding. The same thing as I was saying earlier with sort of anchor institutions appealing to their own self-interest, if you will, by showing that this produces positive benefits, that really that lifts up people in powerful ways, that actually, you know, does benefit places in a way that's far more important than profit. And we're really, I think we're at a point in the history of the world that's going to bear itself out, and is bearing itself out, though, you know, I suppose with some death throes, you know, in our current crises, if you will. You know, the coronavirus pandemic has really highlighted the importance of locality, highlighted the importance of integral services, highlighted the importance of you know, place and planet and all of these things. And so I think we're seeing that happen anyways. And so for us, it's just to continue to support the work that shows how this makes a difference in people's lives in real and meaningful ways, in a way that really is a counterbalance to that sort of argument, in support of the trickle down, that profits at a certain point will benefit everybody, which is just patently false. And we see that now, I think.
Okay. Any other panelists want to come in on that one, or are we really kind of all in agreement with that? Or do you have any specific examples where you've had to kind of make that case to people who've perhaps been not as open as you might like? Or will we move on? Everybody in agreement?
I'll just say very quickly that the discipline of the economist is changing, you know, with the triple bottom line and circular economy and all these different modes. So you just have to find your economists at this point and not waste time with the older versions of who are stuck in their patterns, because there is a lot of new energy happening there.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question that came up in the chat box for Nneka. Nneka, did you see this one? It was asking, do questions of land ownership come in? I think particularly during your presentation when you were referring to that. And this was from Carrie Doyle. And she was saying, I'd expect absentee and corporate landowners holding land as investments that communities could use to address needs and build wealth. I don't know if I've missed a bit of the bottom of that, but do you have any commentary on that particular aspect to the work you're doing in Chicago?
Yeah, so we have a really growing strong land strategy. And so the city has 10,000 vacant lots. And so a lot of our strategy has been around the plethora of lots that the city owns. And so part of what we're doing with federal funding is starting to, you know, there's a lot of environmental work that needs to be done on them, with the goal of eventually transitioning them over to community ownership. So we have a strategy that is around our land, the land that the city owns and the land that the county owns as well, and creating processes to be able to give it over to community. And then there's, you know, strategies where I think the city can play a role in strategically pressuring private ownership of land, I think when we're looking at plots of land that are neighboring lots that the city owns and the county owns, there are strategies that the city has to kind of think about acquiring them. But, I think there's a whole lot of policies to be able to also think about how do you just deter those actions from even happening where you have absentee owners of land. And so I think those are things that are in conversation, but would take a lot more political will to put some of that pressure on.
Okay. Anyone else want to come in on this from their perspective? No. Anne, sorry, Anne, you're on silent again. Yeah.
I just put in the chat that in Somerville, we are running out of land rapidly, so we don't have the circumstance where there's a lot of vacant land available to take. And the city has recognized that they may need to purchase some of that land. They've tried zoning for maker uses to keep the arts community there and the sort of startup there. But now maker can, we could get a biotech company and use that maker space. So we're constantly trying to update the strategies for keeping land accessible to people who can't pay what's now a kind of outrageous market rate.
Okay.
It's a big issue to fight the market ideology in the United States. Yeah.
I think kind of moving on to, I have another question here, which is about, again, context in the states where you're working. And this is from Paul Taylor, and he says, sustainability is a big part of community wealth building. In the USA, I was wondering how challenging that was to deliver under the Trump administration. Clearly different times now, but if you reflect on how it was in the previous administration, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I just put in the chat that it drove everybody out of the federal sphere because it was so hopeless. So depending on the government at different levels, if you had a liberal governor, you had opportunities, but it drove a lot of work into the municipal level and really strengthened the idea that we have to do things locally.
Any other reflections?
And let me just say real quick, and I popped this in the chat too, but that is one of the sort of differences between sort of the US context and the UK context, is there are a lot more authorities and abilities at the local government level. And so even though there was really a pernicious federal administration, things were still able to move, although there are many places where a locality could do things but then had a relationship with the state that was problematic, and so it depended on where you were and what your electeds could do, but to sort of Anne's point, it really did strengthen local government as a tool, and an important tool to actually move things and address need.
Okay. Yeah, it's often not an asset to have such a weak structure at that point, but in this case, when the federal government went totally awry, it proved to be a real advantage.
Okay. Folks, I'm really mindful of time, and I really wish we had longer, to be honest, because it's been an incredibly fascinating, interesting afternoon, and hearing about your experiences in different contexts and different parts of the states. And I think I can see from the reaction that's coming through the chat box that people are feeling the same way. I would say to everybody, there's quite a lot of content in terms of links and information that we will capture. So don't worry if you haven't managed to catch up with all of that and write it all down. We'll make sure that that's included in the follow-up to this event. You'll all get the recording of this event as well. But as I say, I feel as though almost, particularly for this one, we could do with another maybe half an hour, really, to kind of get into some of the discussion, because you've been fantastic speakers and presenters today, and I think we will want to keep real close eye and tabs on how things are progressing with you. But it's a shared experience, because we're obviously in Scotland on a kind of a journey now with community wealth building legislation hopefully coming in the not too distant future, and it's really interesting times here. So I think it would be great through Neil if we can continue this we can say this is really the start, hopefully, of a collaboration and a relationship between ourselves and you as leaders in the field. So thank you really sincerely for being here today, for all your contributions. And I want to thank Elaine and Alison as well for organising and managing the event, as ever, and all the slight technical hitches which we thankfully managed to overcome. And I want to thank you, the audience, as well, really for being here. It's been, I think, a great afternoon. Really enjoyed it. We will continue, I'm sure, with this theme, as I say. Our next event is going to be on local authorities and resources regarding community wealth building. That's taking place on the 8th of March, slightly early at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But for this afternoon, can I just ask, as I say, that you complete the poll if you can. If you haven't done it already, we'll send it out with the information in the aftermath of this event. It helps us to get a sense of where people are at on their community wealth building journey, and it's helping to inform the planning for the other events that we do. So we'd really appreciate it if you wouldn't mind taking the time to complete that, and hopefully we can share the results of that at our next session. Sorry we've run out of time, but really enjoyed this afternoon. Hope you all did too. Thank you so much, as I say, Neil, Sarah, Anne, Neka and Julie for being with us this afternoon. And I really hope we can keep in touch and meet again in the not too distant future. Thank you, everybody.